Joshua Kahn Russell is a social movement facilitator and has trained thousands of activists across the globe. He's the executive director of the Wildfire Project, where he supports progressive grassroots frontline organizations. He has helped campaigns win, defending land, water, and workers' rights against banks, oil companies, logging corporations, and coal barons, from local resiliency projects to national coalitions to the United Nations climate change negotiations internationally. He has spent 20 years as an organizer, campaign strategist, and civil disobedience coordinator. Joshua has spent the last 9 years building a Shipibo ayahuasca practice of dietas in the Peruvian Amazon under the mentorship of Ricardo Amaringo. He is a somatic leadership coach and psychedelic integration counselor. His recent podcast, miniseries, on revolutionary left radio is called Dialectics and Psychedelics, Transformation and Social Struggles. He has written and co-edited numerous books, for which he can tell you about after this talk. Daneille Herrera, who is an MA LMFT, is an Ohlone Land, Oakland-based psychotherapist, providing psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy, psychedelic integration, and harm reduction psychotherapy at Sage Integrative Health and within private practice. Daneille is currently a course facilitator with Beckley Academy, teaching practitioners the foundations of psychedelic-assisted therapies. Daneille is currently a supervisor and clinical consultant for Alchemy Community Therapy Center, where she served as a ketamine-assisted therapist for underrepresented populations. Daneille has extensive history in working with addictions, recovery, and harm reduction with the Harm Reduction Therapy Center and with Dr. Jennifer Fernandez at the California Center for Change. Her experience within these organizations, alongside her early work with the Homeless Children's Network, informs her warm and emotion-focused decolonized framework with attunement to systemic oppressions and violences that impact the individual within a complicated ecosystem. Daneille enjoys working with families, couples, and monogamous and ethically non-monogamous shaping alike, and individuals experiencing spiritual emergence or exploring non-ordinary states of consciousness, queer and trans BIPOC, people who use drugs, and others outside of the mainstream. And without further ado, we welcome Joshua and Daneille.
Thank you, Cade.
Thanks, Cade. You're the best. Hi, everyone. It's so good to have y'all here, and I feel like the sun's staring into my eyes, but you're all still so beautiful. It's incredible. I'm Danny. I'm going to introduce myself using this lens that I like to offer to everybody in the room, which is a more decolonial way of saying this is who I am. It's very easy in these spaces to just give the letters after your last name as well as like your affiliations. But I like to do a more relational thing, so we're going to do that together just as an offering. I'm Danny. I'm queer. I'm a lover. I am a daughter of a Chiricahua, Apache, Filipino, and Chicana mother, and a Pascua Yaqui father. I'm a daughter of 2 drug users. I'm a sister to 2 beautiful, radical queer brothers, and my favorite role on this earth is being an auntie to my 5-year-old nephew. He's the most precious. I am a Marid into the Inayati Maimumi Sufi lineage and a student of ceremonial magic. I integrate that into my practice when I can. I'm a poet. I'm a 7 on the Enneagram. Looking at you, Sherelle. I love people for a living. That's my job. And currently, in this form, I get to do that by being a psychedelic and harm reduction psychotherapist on Ohlone land. I'm here today to co-create a conversation with focus on Joshua Kahn Russell to invite you into the depth of work that I, as a practitioner of psychedelic medicines, feel is absolutely essential in this world. So welcome, Joshua.
Danny is also a fathomless being of light. And I'm just so excited to be in this conversation with you. I'll do, as part of my, I'll take your lead of a decolonial intro. You're going to hear more about my story later. So I just wanted to take a moment to honor all of my teachers because the work and practice that I've been in is informed by many lineages. I have multiple movements that have flowed through me through my life, and that includes a few different landless workers movements in South America, Filipino campesino movements, North American Indigenous Sovereignty and Solidarity movements, a lineage of environmental justice and fighting point source pollution, Black liberation and migrant struggles, as well as queer liberation movements that have taught me how to walk in the world. And I would like to just honor some of my elders and mentors that include Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz, Max Elbaum, Louise Brady, Vandana Shiva, Tom Goldtooth, and some collaborators, Akuya Smith over at Drinking Gourd and Black Liberation and Land Initiative, Ine Begay at Native Movement, Ariel Deranger at Indigenous Climate Action, and my political homes, the Ruckus Society with Charon Lungo and Adrienne Marie Brown, the Wildfire Project with Michael Strom and BJ Starr. I'd like to also just honor Michael Jamal Brooks, may he rest in love, who shaped a lot of my politics, and then my medicine teachers, who you'll hear more about, Ricardo Amaringo, Falacio and Miguel and the Amaringo family, as well as Joe Tafour and Savita Mamek. Finally, I just want to shout out and honor the lineage of Strozzi somatics, including Richard Strozzi and Stacy and Wendy Haynes. And then also my greatest teacher that I'll share more about later, but of various chronic illnesses, including Lyme disease and severe inflammatory conditions that have taught me perhaps more than anything else in the world. So yeah, thanks for giving us the opportunity to deepen in that way, Danny.
Thank you for being relational. I think that's so much of what we're doing here together is just connecting at this level, right? So we are here today with quite a limited time to dive deep into the lessons of Joshua's double decade plus years of experience. So I do offer a bit of a disclaimer when it comes to basic assumptions that all of you brilliant and beautiful audience have a kind of basic understanding of what we mean when we talk about social movements such as grassroots climate justice, indigenous sovereignty, decolonial work, immigrant rights, labor, LGBTQI rights, and racial justice movements. So we're just not gonna explain those and just assume you know what we're saying, as well as medicine work, as well as trauma, as well as the word somatics and the way that we hold that. And we're gonna also assume a bit of a trauma-informed lens here. But we're also available to talk more about it if any of those words are not feeling like comfortable in your body, if they're not feeling like something that you know well. But Joshua, I'm wondering if you can just share the goal of this talk today with the audience.
We're talking about trauma, particularly the trauma that lives in the bodies of activist groups and organizations, as well as coalitions and formations that make change in the world. And so, starting from the place of social movement leaders, activists, carry personal trauma from their lives. It's often the reason why many people become activists, because they realize that their trauma is not their individual experience, but the result of the material conditions of a society. They want to then go change those conditions. Then, often, organizers and activists experience more trauma in the form of repression from taking action about those conditions in the form of police violence, corporate repression, and other things. On top of that, we swim in social movements where people are reproducing our trauma on one another and it lives within the groups that we build. So there's this triple compounding thing that makes the shape of activists as individuals quite particular. And it doesn't just live in the bodies of individuals, but in the collective bodies of organizations. When the self-limiting patterns of behavior that emerge from that trauma become replicated in organizations, it becomes organizational culture, right? And those self-limiting barriers are one of the things that are the most in our control that is holding us back as social movements. So that includes everything from lateral violence, reductive flattening, disposability culture, unhealthy approaches to conflict and power dynamics, other self-marginalizing cultural dynamics that emerge from collective trauma and keeps progressive movements in like the circular firing squads that they often find themselves to be stuck in. And so the proposal of this talk, the proposition, is that if we believe social movements are our main hope for deep societal transformation, we therefore have a responsibility to tend to these collective bodies with the same level of care and attention and rigor and resource that we do individual clients.
I'm so excited to dive deeper. Yes. So as a psychotherapist who does loads of somatic work with individual bodies, as you're speaking to, or sometimes family bodies or group bodies, I'm just noticing how appreciative I am of how you speak to the way that we embody. This is it's at an ancestral level, it's at an intergenerational level, it's at a transgenerational level. The way these stories, these narratives, these sensations and experiences that our bodies and the bodies of our lineage are held and transmuted. In my therapy work, I often tell my clients, this is like one of the things I say a lot, which is nothing can be transmuted or alchemized without first being felt in the body. And if this happens at the level of one individual, undoubtedly it's happening in the collective body as well. So I'm holding your list earlier when you did your introduction of your great teachers. And I know you intimately to know that there's 2 teachers that you could speak to who have been your greatest. I'm wondering if what you can offer the audience today is a little bit of a drop into that personal narrative to share how those teachers have moved through your body and have informed the work that you're doing today.
Yeah. I'll start with the sprint
Necessary.
that was my life from when I was a teenager to till I turned 30, which was I got involved in organizing in the 90s, and where I grew up in Connecticut, there was a lot of public neo-Nazi organizing, and I joined a group that often engaged in street confrontations with those groups. And we were dumb. I did a lot of dumb stuff. And we didn't have a strategy. We didn't talk about strategy.
But you had a punk band.
Well, I did have a punk band, yeah.
That's one strategy.
Yeah. Every song was about racism. Yeah. And but in this notion of like activism just being about like yelling your position loudly enough, like that is gonna change, like, okay. But it was this self-expressive thing. And, if you had asked us to articulate a strategy, it would have amounted to thinking that we could defeat racism by like physically fist fighting Nazis one by one.
Only.
And pretty soon, I learned that this was not, in fact, reducing the amount of violence in my community. And that's when I got interested in social movements. And started to shift my understanding from being an activist, which is raising your voice to make change, to being an organizer, which is creating the conditions, organizations, and infrastructure to support lots of other people raising their voices, right? And so I got involved in pressure campaigns at a pretty young age of, for example, like fighting for pay parity for undocumented custodial workers. And by the time the Iraq War started rolling around, was involved in building these national anti-war networks. And that's what really taught me about strategy, because we, at that time, globally, coordinated the largest mass mobilizations in, at that point, human history, and still did not stop the war. And that shifted my focus, as the through line of this work on climate change, becoming a student of movements in the global south and successful revolutions, like teachers from the Philippines who overthrew the Marcos, dictatorship that was backed by the U.S., for example. And during that period, I was just sprinting, engaged in a lot of high confrontation, nonviolent work, so a lot of nonviolent civil disobedience. We did stuff that I'm proud of. We defeated multi-billion-dollar pipelines. We kicked logging corporations out of indigenous territories. We got banks to pull their funding from extractive, industries, stuff like that. And through that was training activists in strategy, right? But pretty quickly, or maybe not so quickly, actually, over time, as a group facilitator, I learned that the main thing that was getting in the way of groups being as powerful as they could be was not having the perfect strategy on paper, but it was all of the self-limiting cultural practices that I was naming earlier that emerged from trauma. But I was so not attuned to my own path. Like, I had no spiritual life to speak of. I was completely dysregulated. I was not tending to several chronic illnesses that I had been born with. And what the culture of the left taught me was to define myself based on what I do, not based on who I am, right? And so I did a lot. And to pay my rent for living on the planet.
Prove your
right?
worth.
Yeah,
Worthiness was there.
Yeah, which was a trauma response. And this escalated. At first, I just thought, oh, this is burnout, blah, blah, blah. It was after 15 years of Lyme disease. I was bedridden for 3 of those years. I couldn't stay awake for more than 4 hours a day. I had dementia. I didn't know who I was or who other people were. And that's when I got invited to ceremony. By first, it was, teepee ceremony from Native friends up here, and then eventually began what then unfolded as a 10-year ayahuasca practice. And sitting with that medicine in a traditional context literally gave me my life back, but offered me a path towards embodiment, and shifted fundamentally the way that I understand social movements and the way that I understand healing work, and also healed my sense of climate despair from like hanging out at the United Nations with climate scientists in their like silent depression. And the orientation towards that like slowly moved me towards doing this work with activists. So not only was chronic illness my greatest teacher and learning to heal from it, but then also Ricardo Amaringo down in the jungle in the Peruvian Amazon. And so then about 6 years ago, I started working with frontline community leaders and social movement leaders with psilocybin, and then eventually began assisting Ricardo in ceremony and bringing groups of organizers in the organizations that they're in down to the jungle in conjunction with the other work that I do.
I'm a big Joshua fan, so that's pretty much why I'm here. Such profound gratitude to you right now for sharing this journey of yours. With honor to these medicines, both your own graceful suffering and pain, your relationship with your chronic illness that you've grown, and our beloved grandmother medicine. Thankful for you for just bringing these beings into this space. I wanted to do this today because I'm so lucky to know your personal story. And I remember when I met you, I had this feeling of, I wish my clients could see you in practice. My many psychedelic integration clients and psychotherapy clients who are working with integrating ayahuasca or psilocybin or other medicines and drugs that have been supporting them to re-access their body, their spirit, their heart center the way you've been doing. I want them to witness the alchemy of your service and your pain into a relationship with guidance, and then even offer deeper healing work to your community. I'm a big believer that therapy has to be political, because it is. And I'm also a big believer that there's no other direction but deeper. So that's where I want to go next with you. I know you know your trauma body intimately in your work and in your social movements with your kin. So I'm wondering if you can share with the audience your orientation of sorts of how we could be in relationship to social movements for deep collective healing and transformation. No pressure, of course, but just, yeah.
Yeah. Something you just said, Danny, but before I go there, just made me want to emphasize, I had a moment when I was sick when I realized, and this isn't hyperbole, most of my friends these days are people who've been in struggle, frontline social movement leaders for like at least 20 years now. And I realized I don't know a single person who's been doing that work for that long that doesn't have some kind of chronic autoimmune or inflammatory disorder.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. And so it's worth emphasizing that. But at the Wildfire Project, some of our peers in somatics describe oppression in this way. That so number one, oppression creates excessive trauma in the body, right? more than the normal trauma of being a human being on this wild earth, then it distributes that trauma unevenly, right, along lines of class that get filtered through the prisms of race, gender, sexuality. The uneven distribution of trauma then supports the power and position of the ruling group, right, to anchor its structural position in controlling the material resources of a society, right? So I'm talking about the ruling class. Therefore, in terms of healing, the resources that we need in order to heal from that trauma are also inaccessible and unequally distributed. And the only thing that will change that, our proposition, is social movements that can build power as a counterweight to capital, right?
Okay, so what does that look like?
Well, here's what I'm not talking about. I'm not talking about individual activists screaming at each other on social media.
No Facebook fights?
I'm not talking
out.
about the subcultural self-purification rituals of righteous boutique collectives and the self-flagellation of the moral superiority of activist subcultures. I'm talking about groups of people in material physical organizations, networks, coalitions, working towards concrete, measurable change. And so that looks like both a assertion of collective agency in the face of trauma, the way these organizations exert bravery, courage, transformational potential, both purpose and belonging in their sense of vision, as well as like materially, like stopping extractive infrastructure, like mines and pipelines, kicking companies off of indigenous land and returning it to indigenous stewardship, changing laws, building unions, right? Building institutions whereby people can practice self-governance.
Necessary. Well, so you're the executive director currently of a movement organization. Can you describe a little bit about Wildfire Project and what that work looks like in relationship?
Yeah, because the exciting thing is that the work that Wildfire does was the bridge to then the medicine work for me personally. So Wildfire Project does not directly do work with psychedelics or medicine. We support, we're called a movement servicing organization is the jargon, so we support frontline activist groups to transform their cultures in service of healing and power building. And so we do that through long-term partnerships where we do a series of retreats, workshops, coaching, and we work with groups that are frontline organizations in the leading of their sectors, which we named those sectors earlier. So, it's mostly BIPOC organizations, but are working either towards multiracial solidarity or multiracial groups themselves. And primarily we try to our strategy is to work with organizations that want to move beyond reactive single issue campaigns. So move beyond asking for concessions from people in power to a position of wielding power ourselves. So not just groups like fighting back, but fighting forward. And shifting the balance of forces in the long term. And so we are a multiracial, multi-sectoral team of 18 facilitators who come out of these movements. So we're not like a disconnected facilitator class. Our whole team emerged from being organizers and community members in these communities, and that constitutes being able to serve these different sectors because it's the team that serves them are of those communities.
You're making me think of in family therapy work, or actually not even just family therapy work. See, that was like a Freudian slip, because what I say to my clients, as soon as you have more than two people in a room, you have a family system happening and you have all of the enactments occurring. And I could just imagine in the stories you've told me about what it looks like to work with the movement groups. And all the different reactions that are sort of happening, the body that you're having to collectively hold. I'm curious if you can speak to how the movement groups that you work with mirror the body healing from trauma.
Yeah, the way that it shows up in the cultures of organizations are, it shows up as fear, it shows up as hypervigilance, difficulty to trust, misassessment of threat, conflating conflict with harm, lack of skill around conflict, which can lead to disposability, like not being able to navigate conflict without throwing people away. Judgments, rigid black and white
Definitely.
thinking of like this is either oppressive or liberatory. You know, cancel culture, stuff like that. And then on the other side,
Flip side.
social movements, by virtue of people taking action to change their conditions, have the antidotes. They have the deep wisdom that is the medicine. And so movement organizations understand systems.
Yes.
They understand that trauma is not your fault. They have a positive vision for the future and take a step towards something different being possible. You know, those things are a necessary gateway that all trauma healing goes through, is being able to believe that something different is even possible. That's inculcated in the nature of social movements by definition. They create supportive communities of action-oriented people who want to understand each other. They're a container to practice new skills and new ways of being. They are a vehicle that creates a sense of both purpose and meaning in the world, as well as belonging in a society where people don't feel a sense of belonging. And all of those things, you know, they don't heal trauma alone, but they are key parts of people's trauma healing process.
Right.
And they are the conditions of social movements which make them incredible vehicles for healing and transformation, that when groups have members and leaders who are on that healing path, the work in the world mirrors that healing for the sake of healing society.
Totally. Fantastic. And then follow-up question, beautifully said, is then what are some tangible practices that would deepen this work? Maybe even some examples of ones you've used within your work.
Yeah, so the Wildfire Project focuses on what we call relational skills. And so those are things like navigating moments of joining in differentiation, you know, that show up in like a decision-making process of an organization. How do you make collective decisions or flatten power dynamics in a healthy way? How do you practice good accountability and feedback, especially in the face of like high-stakes risks, right? How do you set boundaries and make requests? How do you navigate the pace of your organization? How do you practice purpose and belonging? How do you build power and relationships across difference, right? A lot of the canon that we've kind of inherited, that we've seen use over the last 2.5 decades to navigate multiracial groups, for example, we think is insufficient. So we have different tools for navigating rank and power. How to enter conflict in a way that is generative, meaning it opens up possibilities rather than shuts them down. How do you identify and transform self-limiting beliefs? And then this other piece that coincides with the medicine work, which is having a soulful movement, right? So developing and incorporating ritual, increasing the capacity to sit in contradiction, cultivating the capacity to surrender, right? Which activists are particularly bad at. How to keep the real big picture in mind, right? How to draw on untapped resources of resilience, how to feel visions of freedom, practicing gratitude, practicing in a sense of interdependence. These are things that every successful social movement in history has a lineage of that often younger folks to movements forget how to practice. And so the goal of those things are to support groups to do co-regulation, regenerating safety, increasing our capacity to tolerate distress, experiencing our comrades and each other as safe when that is the case, right-sized belonging, being able to believe in a positive future, setting and maintaining healthy boundaries, you know, practicing consent with how we navigate risk-taking, things like that.
It sounds like therapy. And I love that. I love that you're bringing this into those spaces. So grateful. Thank you for answering these questions. I want to ask you a million more to deepen, but in the interest of time and to give space for Q&A, I have one more direction, which is, okay, so when you come back from the jungle, you have all these stories to tell me, and it's been really beautiful to hear them. So the stories of the groups of the frontline movement workers that you are bringing with you to the jungle with the intention of supporting their trauma healing through ayahuasca Shipibo dietas. Can you paint us a picture or like give us a snapshot? What does this look like? Why does it matter? And what have you learned and integrated from this experience?
Yeah. First, I'll just share, for 8 years of my ayahuasca practice, I was totally in the closet about it in terms of my activist life. I was scared to talk about it, scared of judgments about it. And eventually my teacher was like, all right, you do all this public work, why aren't you sharing the medicine work?
Now he has a podcast, you should listen to it.
He's like, why aren't you talking about this publicly? And I was like, I don't know. I'm like, oh, I don't want to be a white guy talking about ayahuasca. Like, that's, I don't know. And my teacher's like, get over it. Why are you being so selfish with your lessons? You're being selfish because you're like, and so, again, paradigm shift. And when I came out of the closet about my ayahuasca practice, I found that there were like many movement groups, and in particular, Native people in the North that I have had a lot of relationships with who they're like, we want to sit with this medicine in the South and we'd like you to support us doing that. And so I began to be asked to facilitate these beautiful medicine connections that has been the greatest honor of my life, and in particular, working with an organization called Native Movement, which is a federation of Alaska Native women who are doing tribal sovereignty work, land defense, water protection. And so I support 2 cohorts of their organizers coming down to the jungle each year. I just got back a week ago from one of those. And then also doing mixed groups of activist leaders. And so I've been doing those 3 to 4 times a year now. I'm in my 2nd year of doing it. And those trips are about 2 to 6 weeks. And the little bit that I'll share about it before we go to the open up the Q&A is a couple quick lessons are that, at the level of our physiobiology, one key component of building a strong container, which bringing down an organization means they already have a pre-existing container, so all the work you're doing is fortifying that. And the goal, I think, is to build a critical mass of nervous systems in the group that are being regulated, that then regulate the body of the organism itself. And that supports the whole group to then lean into discomfort for the sake of generativity without moving into the alarm zone where they're then in the, a fight, flight, freeze, fawn response, but also not in their comfort zone. And of course, drinking ayahuasca in the jungle, it requires embracing discomfort for the sake of learning. And so then bringing that principle back to the political facilitation I do, right? And we then in Wildfire integrate into our curriculum that co-regulation of nervous systems as a precondition for doing things like conflict work. And the basic arc of it is like a typical somatics arc, right? So first, a group recognizing what's the current shape of our culture, right? Meaning the practices of how we treat each other. Then recognizing, okay, does this manifest our values? Do we want to practice something different? Visioning what that is, right? Asking what new choices will we make? How will we relate to each other in the future? What will that feel like? Then deepening the assessment of the old shape, right? So what are the specific behaviors, beliefs, patterns that make up our old way of being? What are those things taking care of, right? Because they're not going to go away unless we find a different way to take care of those things. But then what's the cost, right? And then, so in somatics, we talk about how choice follows awareness. And so then we create a container whereby previously impossible choices can then get practiced. And then we support the group to practice being in those choices over and over again until they become muscle memory and replace the old patterning. And when we do that, barriers emerge to those new choices. Maybe they're internal conflicts, disagreements, right? Long-held patterns of beliefs. And so a lot of generative stuff happens in the course of those barriers coming up. And then we just go through that cycle and over again. And what I love about doing medicine work with groups is it allows you to go 10 times deeper, right, than a typical workshop. So, yeah, it's going good so far. I'm learning a lot.
Thank you so much. Wow. Yeah, thank you. Can we just give Josh a round of applause? So good. Awesome. Yeah, we'll lead you over to Q&A. I'm just all buzzy now.
Yeah. I want to just name, we often think about these social movements as adult reactions to the world around us. And I often think about in the pre-K through 12 space of young education, how do we shift that to give kids the tools to hold this and to be people who grew up and know how to affect change? And of course, we might still need organization and learning those tools, but like, what are the things that we can do in young education spaces? And I specifically think about like teaching kids what it means to be an upstander, right? And like, how do you hold community with each other as really young kids, where a teacher is giving over power to the students in the classroom and allowing them the space to sort of hold that and call each other in, and like reshaping curriculum to look at community problems and like, how do we solve that as a class, right? And so I think a lot about this. So thank you for talking about it at the adult level.
Well, wait, just to comment on that, Cade, because fun fact, I have another degree in child development, and I came into this work to, originally I thought I was gonna be a child therapist, and then I met their nervous systems, and I was like, oh, your nervous system is just majorly impacted by the adults in your life, so I'm screwed, gonna have to work with adults who use drugs, which is kind of the same thing as working with kids. And like I love that you're thinking about this, because the thing that I found with working with children, even still in my practice now, is like, how can we like teach our children to somatically attune to their bodies, even when they're so tiny? Like what's happening there? How do we teach them pause and like the genius of boredom? For everything to arise. So, but we should get into more questions.
Yes. Before we move on to community questions, how can folks support your work?
Okay, well, as you could guess, now's a fundraising pitch. Actually, it is. So the medicine work does not run through my organization. It is the organization that I named Native Movement, this Federation of Alaska Native Women, has built out within their organization a healing justice scholarship, because our commitment is making this medicine work accessible to working class people, BIPOC people in particular, who work in social movements. And we're trying to figure out how to fund this thing. And it's hard enough to fund social movement work that's led by people of color, let alone then you bring in healing, and then you bring in psychedelics. And so if there's anyone interested or who knows ways to help resource the work, I've been like fundraising for each of these trips in an ad hoc basis. And it's working so far, but it's not gonna be sustainable. We're building out like a vehicle for it that is going to be housed within this Indigenous-led organization, where the resources then go towards an Indigenous-owned healing center, which is where we go with my teacher, Ricardo, and that also has a land-back project component of it. So we didn't have time to talk about it, but another through line of all of this is resource redistribution. It's not just getting people access to healing, but it is about supporting Native people, in this case, both in Peru and in Alaska, having access to resources to govern their own stuff, and then there's a couple of us like me that are just trying to support them and making it happen. So. Fantastic. Thank you. We'll talk afterwards. Yeah.
Bravo.
Thank you. Any other commitments?
Yeah, exactly. Going once, going twice. I'm gonna do a fundraising plug here too. So Joshua and I are friends because we both care about the under-resourced and systemically underprivileged folks. And as he spoke to the unsustainability of funding, I'm really close to Alchemy Community Therapy Center, and at the beginning of the psychedelic therapy birthing, in the beginning of the Renaissance, so to speak, Alchemy did have a lot of support, and the support is becoming more and more limited. So there's a couple ways you can support them. One thing right now that's happening that I'm just going to shamelessly tell y'all about is the ketamine provider training. It just opened up for unlicensed folks as well. If you have a master's degree, or if you're moving towards licensure, that's great. You could take the training. I'll be teaching there, and just spread it to your friends. Alchemy is, just give me one more minute. Alchemy is the only organization within the country that provides psychedelic assisted therapy that pays their interns and their clients are paying fees as low as $15 a session. I provided ketamine therapy for somebody who was paying $30 for 3 hours, okay? Yeah. Thank you. It's incredible work. Most clients are severely low income, BIPOC. Anything you can do to just spread the word, follow their Instagram, and everything would be so awesome. Thank you so much. Oh, thank you.
Okay. Thanks so much for all this. My question is, really for larger transformation is to expand our coalitions and I don't have any problem preaching to the choir. I do it all the time. I'm just curious as how do we enlarge the choir. With some things are so polarized. There's probably some that don't like to sing with us, but where do you see sort of some space for folks in our world and society that aren't quite there, but maybe we could get them to join us through doing some of this work? Just curious on your thoughts about that.
I'm not sure if I understand the question. Maybe if you answer, then yeah.
Sure. Yeah, there's so many, the political answer from our work is thinking about broad-based coalition building, meaning how do you build institutions that recognize that a growing majority of people in this society are working class and have material conditions in common, even if their experience of those things is different and structured by their culture or other aspects of their identity. And so as a pro-solidarity organization, we support groups that try to build like broad-based campaign work where people can see a mutual self-interest, as opposed to, there's a different approach that's like, if we just build this patchwork of a coalition of smaller groups that have disparate interests, but we have like an academic analysis that says it's all connected, so they should all know that it's connected, kind of thing. And so examples of that are that when I was involved in coordinating a campaign to stop the Keystone XL oil pipeline, which was this major pipeline infrastructure project. It was an 11-year campaign, and the coalition that it brought together was the leadership of it was Indigenous tribes throughout the Midwest as well as Canada. And then there were the other sort of typical characters such as teachers and students. But then there was also all of these conservative landowners and farmers who had a material interest in stopping the pipeline. There was also labor that on its surface, unions that were promised jobs from the pipeline, that if there was an organizing effort that basically like pitched at the same time an infrastructure investment plan would give them more jobs, right? And so one of the coolest coalitions that I've ever witnessed, they named it somewhat jokingly, but it stuck, the CIA, the Cowboy Indian Alliance. And it was like libertarian conservative landowners working with tribal leaders, and it didn't matter if they agreed politically on their worldview. They had a shared material interest in common of protecting their watershed. And that's also the logic of a union, you know? It's like one of my mentors, Jane McAlevey, was talking about organizing a nurses union, where you need to get everyone in that shop to fight together because their healthcare depends on it. It doesn't matter if one of those people's a Trump voter, right? And so one of the traps that activists fall into is this notion of like, we only want to work with people who think like us, right? The whole point is to work with people who don't think like you, but the way that you work with them and find alignment is by identifying the actual material conditions in both of your lives that are going to change. And in order to do that well, this is where so that's like building the choir, right? But the organizers need to know how to sing on key, though, you know? So that's where the healing and transformation of movement leaders matters. And that's where like working with psychedelics that help activists break out of their like good, bad, right, wrong binary and develop compassion for the way that other people are shaped matters. Because then the choir sings on key and then more people want to join the song, you know?
Hi, you just answered part of my question. I was going to ask about whether or not you're doing any work in the Midwest. I work in housing justice in Omaha, Nebraska, and there's a lot of folks there that could use a lot of support when we're doing that work. And so I was just curious about, I've been here and hearing a lot of things that are going on the coasts, and maybe that's what you just mentioned about the Keystone organizing and activism is how you're working there, but I'm just curious if there's more space to move in the Midwest. It's definitely needed.
Yeah, we're not currently doing any work with groups in Nebraska. However, on that campaign, Bold Nebraska was just doing, you know, phenomenal work, and I think they still exist. But a lot of as the Wildfire Project, we're connected more in like a little bit north, you know, like we're in Minnesota, where there's groups like Inquilinex Unidex that is like a undocumented tenants union, where they are organizing like undocumented renters who are like literally winning victories, extracting millions of dollars from slumlords and stuff like that. And so it's pretty incredible work that they're doing, as well as a group called Setul up there. And you know, my sense is that I actually think that people on the coasts can learn a lot from certainly Southern organizing and the like federated land cooperatives that are happening in the Black land movement in particular. But then in places like Minnesota with these with this sort of like housing infrastructure that they're building, definitely in the Bay Area, we could learn a lot from that.
Hi. One of the controversies we're dealing with is in the caregiver communities for therapy and medicine. You know, I've been involved with studies for psilocybin and ketamine and MDMA treating moral injury and fatigue. And so, in your work in these groups, one of the issues we're dealing with, and I'm curious, is like when you bring a group of people that do work together and are already in existing power relationships amongst each other, because some people are in hierarchical organizations, they're bosses or supervisors or people who are in power relationships, and then if you get them into a circle and they all take medicine together, you're in double role relations, right? Because you're tripping with your boss or the person that you decide they're going to be hired or fired, and I'm assuming, so I'm just curious how you manage that, because the solution has been to actually not do that. Like you have to be either with peers or in individual work or in separate groups, or to have, but it's so powerful also to have a family dynamic unit in a workplace environment, whether it's activism or therapy communities, like working together. But those double role relationships are super messy too.
Yeah, I don't know the answer to that. I haven't done group medicine work with like a nonprofit organization. The groups that I bring down organize themselves, like there's a reason why it's fit well, which is that they are Native people who their whole lives have sit in ceremony together. So they haven't sat in ayahuasca ceremonies together, but they already know how to navigate multiple relationships to one another, and there's already a container for that. And so then my role as someone who's not in that community and holding that space is about learning from the ways that they work and navigate that space together with this new medicine. And so that has felt appropriate, it has felt right-sized, but I have not done that. Like I haven't brought an organization to the jungle that's not those groups. What I have done is bring mixed groups of movement leaders who are not in groups together, where we're creating a new container. But what Wildfire's work is then doing like retreats and workshops that have nothing to do with psychedelics with those kind of groups. Yeah.
All right, let's give Josh and Daneille a round of applause.